So hello everyone, my name is Atif Ali. I am graduate student in sustainable energy at SUNY ESF. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. The topic of the webinar is drivers of bioeconomy, New York State and US perspective. And we have two very distinguished speakers with us who will be speaking about the drivers of bioeconomy in New York State perspective and the US perspective. So agenda for the webinar is we'll do the brief introductions, and after that Dr. Brown will tell us about what are the drivers of bioeconomy in New York State perspective, and after that Dr. Golden will tell us about the drivers of bioeconomy in US perspective, and we will take your questions at the end of this session. And we'll talk a little bit about the CABLE program. So CABLE is Consortium for Advanced Bioeconomy Leadership Education, which is organization of 20 different universities in the US. And this program was funded by USDA and National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And this webinar is being hosted as part of the CABLE program because I am a part of CABLE cohort 4, and this webinar is in partial fulfillment of their requirements to participate in that program. And our first speaker is Dr. Tristan Brown, who is Associate Professor of Energy Resource Economics at SUNY ESF, and he's also Director of Bioeconomy Development Institute at SUNY ESF and Advisory Panel Member to New York State Climate Action Council. We are very pleased to have him with us. And we are also very pleased to have Dr. Ray Golden with us, who is Sponser Ali Professor of Environmental Sustainability and Finance at Syracuse University. He also serves on the board of Scientific Counselors to EPA and consultant to industry and government. Just before we invite our speakers to start the presentations, housekeeping rules, please keep your microphones muted during the presentation, and we will take all of your questions at the end of both presentations. We will not be taking questions during the presentations. And with that, I will invite Dr. Brown to tell us about the drivers of bioeconomy in New York State perspective. Over to you, Tristan.
Great, thank you very much, Atif. Oh, and it looks like screen sharing's been disabled again.
Oh, really?
There we go. It's all set now. All
okay,
right.
Thank you.
Must have been because yours was still up.
Oh, yeah.
Great. Is my screen up okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone. Great to be here. As Atif mentioned, I'm closely involved in work that New York State is doing to completely decarbonize its economy, and the bioeconomy is going to be playing a very important role in that process. And so I want to talk a little bit about, the specific motivations for why we're doing this in New York State, and then go in a little bit of detail about how it's going to ultimately be conducted. All right, now if I can just get my screen to work. There we go. Okay, so bad news is we're in trouble. We are ultimately rapidly approaching the point where catastrophic climate change is going to become unavoidable without some pretty drastic action on our part. And this figure I've got here, this is from the United Nations IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, something called the AR6. It's the 6th assessment report. The early parts of it were released back in August, and then it's been coming out in phases ever since then. But I think this is one of the single most important figures shown in that report. What this is showing is the trajectory that greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, or at least for carbon dioxide, have to follow in order to achieve specific temperature thresholds, right? So to keep temperatures below certain, or temperature rises below certain thresholds. And so these numbers over here on the right side, right, SSP 5 to 8.5, what that really means is 5 degrees Celsius to 8.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase. And so you can work your way down. The main thing to keep in mind, though, is climate scientists generally agree catastrophic climate change is going to be at 2 degrees Celsius. We hear sometimes you really need to keep it 1.5 degrees Celsius or lower, but 2 degrees Celsius is the broad consensus. And what this figure is showing is if we're going to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, or at least have a high probability of doing so, we have to not just completely decarbonize our economy, the world economy. We actually have to go negative, right? Net negative. So what that really means is by mid-century, we need to be sequestering more CO2 than we're actually emitting. And that's that light blue line there, right? It says 1 to 1.9. so staying below 2 degrees Celsius increase, not only do we need to go net negative by mid-century, but by the end of this century, we need to be sequestering approximately half as much CO2 every year as we are currently emitting. So this is not just something where we can just, electrify everything, decarbonize, get to zero and say we're set. We waited too long. And now we're actually going to have to start, reversing the past greenhouse gas emissions in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. So that's a big motivation for New York State, especially when I start talking about New York State's climate law. This is really the context to keep in mind, right? Is that we really have to take very, very serious action, and we have to achieve great things by mid-century. The other big driver, this is one of the other main ones. I shouldn't say the other big one because there's quite a few of them, but one of the other really important drivers is the fact that even if we electrify, all the things that we can currently electrify, and so, we're talking about, say, replacing your natural gas heater with an air source heat pump, and the electricity from that comes, completely from solar PV, wind, etc. Right? Even if you do all that, there are a number of important fossil fuel applications that are going to be either difficult or downright impossible to replace with electricity by mid-century. So if you look at, and this is from the International Energy Agency, but it's just showing, right, all the different things that we're using that are ultimately contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at future demand growth for petroleum, right, and so we're really talking about between now and 2030, 77% of the world's future demand growth is expected to come in the form of either aviation fuel, so this is your jet fuel for a commercial airliner, road freight, so this is going to be heavy duty transportation, or petrochemicals, right? So you think about all the plastics we use, pharmaceuticals, things like that. These all come from fossil fuels. They are difficult, and in some cases, right, petrochemicals, downright impossible to replace with electrification. And so even if we electrify everything, we are still going to be using fossil fuels. And not only are we still going to be using fossil fuels, we're actually going to be increasing our fossil fuel demand unless we find other opportunities to displace those fossil products. And related to that, right, one of the fastest growing products in terms of demand worldwide is plastic. We hear a lot about plastics, right, because of, the massive plastic island that exists in the Pacific Ocean, for example, and things like that. But, we're kind of fiddling at the margins right now. Demand for plastic is actually growing worldwide at approximately twice the rate as gross domestic product. So you think about how fast the global economy is growing, demand for plastic is actually going at twice that rate. And so, it's not enough to engage in a little more recycling or things like that, right? Or figure out landfill diversion. All the plastics we use today, or I should say the vast, vast majority of the plastics we use today come from fossil fuels. Here in the United States, the vast majority actually comes from natural gas. We used to get a lot of it from petroleum, but then natural gas prices got very cheap about 10 years ago to go to the hydraulic fracturing revolution. And so now that is primarily coming from natural gas. And so as long as we're using plastics, we're going to use fossil fuels. But it's actually even worse than that. Natural gas, as it moves through pipelines, leaks. Now, there's a big variation in the amount of plastic or the methane or natural gas that ultimately leaks, but some of it escapes from the pipeline as you move it from point A to point B. Well, the primary component of natural gas is methane, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. Here in New York, we actually attribute it, well, we term a global warming potential of 84. And what that means is, according to New York, the global warming potential, the climate change impact of methane is 84 times more powerful than an equal amount of carbon dioxide. So even though, right, even if you never combust that plastic, you never burn it, there's no combustion greenhouse gas emissions associated with it, as long as those plastics are being produced from natural gas, they are going to be directly contributing to climate change just because of the way natural gas escapes across its supply chain. And so as long as demand for plastic is growing at a very rapid rate, unless we find other sources of plastics, especially from renewable sources, we are going to be contributing to climate change, even though there's never any combustion involved there. Well, the sad part about this is ultimately there is a very extensive natural gas petrochemical supply chain in the US. So we convert natural gas to ethane. which is what we term a steam cracker. So we take natural gas, we run it through a steam cracker, and we get ethane out. And you can also use naphtha, which would be coming from petroleum. But as I noted, about a decade ago, we really shifted heavily in favor of ethane. And then that ultimately is what goes into our petrochemical facilities and comes out at the end of the supply chain as plastics. Well, most of the petrochemical facilities in the United States are clustered along the Gulf Coast, whereas the natural gas production tends to be at minimum several hundred miles away, and in some cases actually over 1,000 miles away. So what that means, and this is what this map is showing, every green line is a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline. That natural gas is moving over very long distances, and every additional mile to that supply chain, you have more methane leakage that's going to occur. And so again, right, even though we never combust the natural gas that goes into our plastics, it is still contributing to climate change. And depending on how much methane is leaking out, this can be a very substantial contributor for something that you never actually end up combusting. So New York's response to this, right, all these different drivers, has been to develop what's termed a climate-focused bioeconomy. And this is actually the specific language that's used here in New York. In 2019, New York State adopted something called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, what you'll frequently hear referred to as the CLCPA. This was billed as the world's most ambitious climate change legislation when it was passed. California quibbles with that. They have some very ambitious legislation as well, and now Massachusetts does too, but it is certainly among the most ambitious policies, climate policies at least, in the world. What it requires the state to do is achieve at least an 85% reduction of economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So it's not just transportation, it's not just power, it's every sector of the economy. And the state has the option to go even further and achieve a 100% reduction economy-wide by 2050, with that additional 15% coming in the form of sequestration, where you're going to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, bury it below ground, and offset some fossil emissions that you really can't get away from in the other. One of the key provisions in the CLCPA is the creation of something that's called a scoping plan. And the scoping plan lays out exactly how the state is going to achieve this very ambitious target. Well, the state released its draft scoping plan on December 30th, so just a few weeks ago. And in that, the draft scoping plan proposed to create a climate-focused bioeconomy. And so the bioeconomy in New York State is not just something we say, hey, this would be nice to have. Now the state is proposing to make this a critical component of its very ambitious climate legislation. Well, it goes even further and it actually defines this for us. And so just to show you what they're talking about, the bioeconomy is defined as a part of the economy that displaces fossil fuel products with bio-based products. Historically, this has been done, but it's primarily been in the realm of alcohol fuels, right? Here in the US, for example, we produce about 16 billion gallons per year of corn ethanol. That's an early form of the bioeconomy to displace gasoline. That said, we're increasingly seeing other types of fuels, and specifically hydrocarbon fuels, start to play a role. And so when I talk about things like heavy-duty transportation, aviation, alcohols, aviation, you can convert alcohols to that, but ethanol, you can't just blend ethanol with a jet fuel and actually get it to run. You're going to need hydrocarbons. And so these increasingly, we're starting to see hydrocarbon fuels become a critical component of the bioeconomy. There's been a lot of controversy about some of the past fuels, like corn ethanol, for example, whether or not they're sustainable. And so New York's taken a step further with this climate-focused bioeconomy, which it defines as the part of an economy that produces sustainable, renewable, bio-based feedstocks, rather than fossil fuel-based feedstocks, to produce products that achieve climate and social justice requirements. So what this is really saying is the bioeconomy needs to contribute to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it also needs to contribute to reductions of other types of pollution. So particulate matter emissions, SOx emissions, NOx emissions don't necessarily contribute to climate change, but they do cause negative outcomes to human health, strongly associated with fossil fuel use. And so it's displacing those as well. Also, it says, you're right, this is the other component of this. So it's not explicitly stated, but in this, climate and ecosystem services also fit within the climate-focused bioeconomy in some applications. So this, I'm going to come back to this, but carbon sequestration is explicitly referenced by the draft scoping plan as part of the climate-focused bioeconomy. So this is New York's approach to this very intractable problem that we find ourselves in. Now, we have seen a number of instances where the bioeconomy has been not just successful, but it has actually increased very drastically. California, for example, has been, at least from the transportation sector side, developing a climate-focused bioeconomy in the form of its low-carbon fuel standard for over a decade now. And it's just an early example of how drastically and rapidly these things can scale up. When the low-carbon fuel standard went into effect in 2011, there was virtually no what we term biomass-based diesel used in the state. And so that's biodiesel or renewable diesel, so either a hydrocarbon fuel or something very similar to a hydrocarbon fuel that can displace fossil fuels in heavy-duty transportation. Virtually nothing produced or used in California because there's virtually nothing produced worldwide. The first half of 2021, nearly 50% of all the diesel fuel used in California came from a renewable resource. So that is, and California is the country's largest diesel fuel market. So a very rapid scale up in a relatively short period of time. We are seeing renewable diesel specifically. This is one of the other fuels, or one of the components of biomass-based diesel, is increasing very rapidly, as I mentioned, right? Virtually no production in 2010. We're now expected to hit over 3 billion gallons per year in the US alone by 2024, as much as 5 billion gallons per year by 2025. We're actually producing so much now. The big concern is that we don't have enough feedstock to produce it all. And this is a headline from Reuters that just came out a week ago. New study out, less than half of projected US renewable diesel output likely by 2025. It's not we don't have the production capacity, it's that we don't have enough of the feedstocks. And that's because right now we're using primarily lipid feedstocks, soybean oil, distillers corn oil, to a lesser extent, waste oils. And so we're going to need to find new resources, especially lignocellulosic biomass resources that we can utilize. We're also seeing a pretty rapid scale up in bio-based chemicals, right? So I mentioned petrochemicals, as the name suggests, those come from petroleum. Well, we are starting to look at biomass-based versions of those, because again, just because you never combust a fossil fuel doesn't mean that it doesn't have a climate impact. And so to truly get away from that, we have to find biomass-based versions of these petroleum and natural gas fossil fuel-based products that we currently utilize. In terms of how it contributes to the environment and human health, right, from the fuel side, this is an analysis that was done looking at a number of different hydrocarbon fuels, specifically from lignocellulosic biomass. And what we see is there's a wide variation in terms of its global warming potential reduction compared to fossil fuels, but you can achieve in excess of a 90% reduction to the carbon intensity of fossil fuels using, in this case, lignocellulosic biomass. So you can achieve some very substantial reductions to the negative climate impacts of fossil fuels. Biomass-based diesel, when it comes to human health, right? We talk about some of those co-pollutants, particulate matter, etc. Using biomass-based diesel, either blends of biodiesel with renewable diesel or pure renewable diesel, you can also achieve very substantial, between 25 to up to almost 50% reductions to these co-pollutants that negatively affect human health. And then you can even, and this is something that companies are starting to commercialize, this is from a company called Gevo that's ultimately going to be producing aviation fuel, but it is showing how using regenerative agricultural techniques, you can actually achieve negative emissions, right? A carbon negative fuel. They're showing a fuel that they produce ethanol, but they show how combining it with renewable electricity, soil amendment technologies, regenerative agricultural practices, you can actually produce a fuel that, even though you're combusting it and it releases CO2 when you combust it, over its life cycle, it's going to sequester more CO2 than is ultimately emitted. Products, right? Same type of thing. You look at various petrochemicals. If you look at bio-based versions of those chemicals, you can achieve global warming potentials reductions of 50% or more, depends on the chemical. But again, right, this is when we talk about contributing to that environmental aspect. This is some work that colleagues at SUNY ESF have been conducting, showing that you can actually produce lignocellulosic biomass in the form of shrub willow, that when you grow it in certain conditions, it's going to sequester more CO2. It's actually going to bury carbon. It's going to contribute to below ground soil carbon additions, or I should say, just say below ground carbon additions. And in some cases, You can actually sequester more CO2 when you're producing that feedstock than is emitted when you convert it to energy or convert it to a fuel that is then converted to energy. So, right, this is just, even if you would take it to a chemical, for example, this is going to be a carbon negative product. You're going to be reversing past climate change, or past greenhouse gas emissions. And then from a human health standpoint, right, if you were to produce, say, a renewable natural gas, that you get your petrol or your commodity chemicals from that way, this is just showing, again, you can achieve very, very large reductions to co-pollutant emissions that way as well. So ultimately, what New York is looking at doing is trying to replicate petroleum, but doing this in a way that's going to produce lots of different products from biomass. And so the key point here, busy slide, but it's not just fuels, it's fuels and products. And ultimately, if you can do that in a carbon negative way, that's going to be the most appealing aspect of all. So there's what New York is proposing to do, or at least one possible way that it's looking to implement the climate-focused bioeconomy. And it's a variety of different things, but a few that I've highlighted here. Renewable natural gas, by 2030, using up to a 9% blend of renewable natural gas with natural gas, 75% renewable distillates. So this is biodiesel, renewable diesel, ultimately sustainable aviation fuel, and then ultimately going carbon negative by mid-century. So aligns very closely with what I was talking about earlier from the IPCC. So if you're interested, this is the, again, the draft scoping plan is a very large document, but if you pull it open and do a search for climate-focused bioeconomy, this is the section that comes up. And so you can just see there's a number of different policies that the state is ultimately going to be adopting in that regard. And very similar to what I talked about earlier, but this is pulled straight from that draft scoping plan. And the final thing I'll note is at ESF and with colleagues at SU, including the one who's going to be speaking momentarily, we have developed created the Bioeconomy Development Institute. And this really is going to be focused on how do you develop a bioeconomy, New York State, but also looking with partners outside of the state to implement all these different aspects of the climate-focused bioeconomy that I've just been talking about. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Golden. Good luck.
All right, I appreciate that. A thumbs up from anybody that you can see my PowerPoint? All right, great. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes just kind of giving a high-level discussion as to what are some of the trends, where has really the bio-based products and the broader bio-based economy in the US, where has it been, and kind of where it's going, again, at a very high level. So I kind of frame it into three different areas. One is bio-based products, which generally have a USDA bio-preferred label and or also the EPA Safer Choice label. Going into sustainable and bio-based chemistry, as well as bioenergy and biofuels. Okay, so let's talk first a bit about bio-based products. On the right, and I'll reference some of these, and if people want them at the end, there's my email, and you can reach out to me and I could forward you some of these reports, or they're available also when you kind of Google them. But each year, really since about 2014, I've been working with colleagues and we've been producing for USDA, and every time the Farm Bill comes reauthorized for Congress, trying to understand where the economic as well as the environmental implications of the US bio-based products industry. And on the right is the most recent report, and we're going to be undertaking the next one. There's usually about a 2-year lag time just to try to get the information. And you can see a number of those different reports. And what we look at is employment at the national level, but also employment at the state level, as well as employment by industrial sector of the bio-based economy. And then within the environment, we look at things like oil displaced, GHG, land use, water. And then throughout that, we interview industry. Major Fortune 500 companies, think of Ford and Motor and how they use bio-based within the interior. More and more interiors of vehicles are primarily bio-based ingredients, all the way to small and medium enterprises and how they are actually trying to show growth in a growing market segment. The figure on your right, well, let me go on first on the left. So when we talk about bio-based products, that's a subset of the US bio-based economy. And what you'll see is it really does not include energy. It certainly does not include pharma. There's another report, which I'll reference later, that we do annually that takes the broader bioeconomy. But I want to start first with the bio-based products. We look at each of these sectors on the left. On the right is a little dated. We'll be updating it, but kind of the location quote. And so it really looks in reference to each state as a baseline compared to other states on the economy on the whole within the bio-based products industry. So for all those on Zoom, you can compare New York or Ohio or North Carolina. The darker the green shows that that state is more intensive as far as the percent of the employment related to the bio-based products industry. As a subset of that, under the Farm Bill, which dates back, the US Farm Bill dates back to the 1930s as far as an effort post-depression, and it's renewed every 5 years, and it's one of the larger funding mechanisms in the United States. Currently, there are about 15,000 products that are included in the BioPreferred program that obtain the USDA BioPreferred label that you see on the right that goes on consumer products. Of these, about 12,500 qualify for mandatory federal purchasing initiatives. By that, the president, and it's gone back for multiple presidents, can do executive orders. And those executive orders try to use the purchasing strength of the US government, which is very extensive, as you can imagine, to move markets. And so there are mandates that the US government purchase bio-preferred, bio-based products over conventional fossil fuel products. And then just as a reference in our latest research, just between 2017 and 19 to show kind of market pull, the number of products certified per year has increased by 92%. A lot of more companies are actually filling out the paperwork and trying to get their products certified under the bio-based and bio-preferred program. A little bit of lag. Okay. Here's just, this goes back to 2017. Again, there's a lag in getting data through from the government as it's accumulated. So usually it's about a 2-year lag. So you could just see back in 2017, the number of people employed is 4.6 million in the US, again, for this subset of just the bio-based economy. The value added contributions, about 470 billion. And then you'll also see on here how we look at the jobs multiplier, which is basically saying for every direct job in the bio-based products industry, there's 1.79 additional jobs. So when you look at this, you're looking at direct, indirect, and induced. Direct jobs, I am manufacturing the product. Indirect, I'm part of that supply chain. Induced is my plant is based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I have an induced number of support services that are part of that. And then you can look at, for different areas, direct employment by state, which we do, and then we break it down to subsets of the different parts of the bio-based economy. One thing, you know, there are big pulls. So biochemicals is a big pull. When you think about forestry, especially in the Southeast, when you look at states like Georgia, North Carolina, that's a big employment pull, et cetera. And then if you look over time from 2013 to 2017, pulled from one of our reports, you can see the millions of full and part-time jobs for the employment, as well as the increased dollar amount for the value add for the economy. This is for bioplastics and packaging. And again, I'm not going to show all of them, but we break this down by each of these different categories, and you can see where the movements are. Enzymes, for instance, is growing, but enzymes is really captured by just a couple of major companies. It's not a well-distributed industrial sector. So let's talk about sustainable chemistry as a part. And sustainable chemistry is driven by bio-based chemistry. Sustainable chemistry or green chemistry goes back to the days of Paul Anastas, who's kind of the father of green chemistry, a professor at Yale and was assistant administrator at EPA. On the right is a report that just came out this last September, October, where myself and colleagues really examined this part of the sector from what policies are happening, but also how's industry adopting it. So this is really important. This work was done in partnership with NYU, and what it shows is between 2015 and 2019, green chemistry, which is bio-based chemistry, is a big part of that, grew at 11.3%, where conventionally marked chemistry products only grew at 0.9. There are major consumer and, more importantly, institutional buyer pulls for green chemistry. Institutional buyers are primarily major manufacturers, brands, and retailers. And I'll be showing another slide on that. But this is very important. The growth rate of 12.6 times faster than conventional counterparts and 5.4 more than the entire market. So this tells investors that there is a marketplace for this and that these are worthy of future investments, capital investments. In a very unusual move in our recent set of governance in the United States, in January 1st, Congress overrode President Trump's veto of the Defense Reauthorization Act. And within that, a big part was the Sustainable Chemistry Research and Development Act. This is a very bipartisan support. As you saw in the House, it passed 322 to 87, and in the Senate, 81 to 13. And it makes sense. What it's saying is we, the US, are planting our flag in sustainable bio-based chemistry and products for a number of reasons. We see where the market's going and we want to plant our flag and we want to stimulate growth in the green economy. It also, when you think about it, bridges rural and urban in red and blue. You have the farmers in the agricultural belt, you have manufacturing in the Rust Belt, you have those who are more inclined to support sustainable green technologies along the coast. So it really brings everybody together. What does that mean for us on the Zoom, academics, students? There's going to be more R&D pushed towards this and a greater emphasis on policies and procedures to really help invigorate the market. Tristan talked about aviation and GIVO, for instance. You know, my lab is called the Dynamic Sustainability Lab because the dynamics and the pace of what is happening within the last 12 months is unprecedented in my whole career. As one example, yes, we're seeing the EV transition. Yes, 30 to 40% of our largest commodity, corn, is used for ethanol, which could have significant implications for the Midwest. But the entire commercial and business aviation sector came out just in the last few months and said, we are committing to net zero by 2050. Now, the issue is, as Tristan talked about, is there enough fuel? But when you look at grams of CO2 per passenger kilometer, you can see how aviation really impacts it. Transportation is our biggest impactor for greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And on the right, I just try to show you is, hey, there are total offtake volumes, commitments by airlines for sustainable aviation fuels out into the future. And then you can also look at the increased demand, even now there's a blip because obviously of COVID, but it's going to continue even at a greater extent for aviation. So that's building up the platforms and the infrastructure for what we would consider bio-based fuels. The other part, as I consider, is I'm going to show a few more slides. I love the figure I did not create on the left, but really kind of indicative of our transition from a fossil fuel legacy energy industry to a bio-based and sustainable product solution. And there are things that are happening in the market which are really showing that. One is ESG, for those who aren't familiar, that's environmental social governance funds, as well as shareholder pressures. So on the left, you can see the increase, and this is just to Q4 of 2020, it is rapidly increasing well over that in 2021. It outperformed the market as a whole, ESG funds. But you can see the investments by institutional investors, think pension funds, think your larger brokerages. And then on the right, as we're investing more and more into sustainable products and sustainable companies, there's increased shareholder pressures, including by the major investment houses, to address climate change, along with other sustainability metrics. On the right, I just show a quick picture of ExxonMobil from news that was relatively recent, May of 2021. There are many other instances. If you guys shop at TJ Maxx, their shareholders had a huge revolt in regards to green chemistry and carbon, and this is happening across the board in all sectors. So companies are feeling the pressures, CEOs are feeling the pressures to address climate. And as such, if you look on the left, you see that industry commitments transform to net zero. On the right, at the top, organizations that have committed to net zero. On the bottom right is actually Procter & Gamble, how they're marketing and advertising this. And this is all happening very quickly. There's actually a race, just similar to how the UK said we're going to go to no more internal combustion engines by a date. Then California came in more aggressive, UK came back to try to match California. We see that with industry as well. And these are big dollars. So if you look outside of just the US government, these are multinational corporations. Think of a Walmart with 66,000 tier 1 suppliers. Those tier 1 suppliers are Adidas, Apple, Procter & Gamble, you name it, and they have their tiers. So when you have major corporations saying we are going to go to these commitments, and you have scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 being your supply chain, and you're accounting for those carbon emissions, that's going to be a big pull. And so the whole notion of bio-based and low carbon solutions is gaining great traction. So much so that Tristan and I just got off a Zoom with major industry, looking at the potential for something like the USDA creating under their bio-based product a carbon intensity label. This isn't because the government says we need it. Rather, it's industry saying we need a way to quantify the carbon intensity of products. And we believe that USDA is a trusted source, as is the BioPreferred. And then my last slide is just, we'll be working together under USDA, under the bio indicators. We annually pull in all the data and then develop a dashboard for the government in regards to production, you name all the data metrics, et cetera. It's free to use. With my transition to Syracuse, this is something that we'll be loading up. But if you as researchers, I put this up here, and as students have interest in this data, let me know. It's something I'm going to be working with Tim Volk at SUNY ESF and Tristan to see if we can't do something jointly to host it and make this the national database for the bio-based and bio-indicators data each year. So with that, there's my email on the left. So if anybody wants to contact me, get any copies of the reports, I am more than happy to get them to you. Or if you want to go through Tristan, please, I'll make sure that he has access to them and he can get them out too. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown and Dr. Golden. And now we will open the floor for questions. And you can either put the questions in the chat or unmute yourself and you can ask the questions directly.
Good afternoon. I have a question, if I may, Atif.
Yeah, sure.
Tristan and Jay, thank you very much for the presentation. Jay, big kudos to you for the name. Yeah, I'm wearing my orange, my beloved alma mater. I wanted to show that I also support SU as well. So my question is kind of for the entire panel, and I'm looking forward to the inputs of each. But how much do you think we bridge the drive to a true zero, and how much of that bridge can be through some transitional fuels on the way to a net zero, and then to eventually a true zero, if that's even attainable? So I'm curious to hear some commentary on that multifaceted query.
I mean, I'll start and I'll let Tristan jump in as well, and Tim, others. There has to be a transition, and there are transitional. You know, the EU I talked about ESG and the finance. EU just passed a scheme to really codify that. And they actually included nuclear as a green technology and green energy, and natural gas. And the reason they did so, and there's consternation, you know, Germany doesn't want nuclear, and others are kind of, you know, France is heavy nuclear. So there's those internal battles, but they just, Jay is the same way. They're thinking there has to be a transition, and we have to make it pragmatic in that transition. I will say, you know, we talked also like with GEVO, but there are companies also like Origin Materials. And Origin Materials is really a carbon negative material. That's what they're developing, and they're going to be expanding. And I say that because there's a lot of, you know, there are so many moving parts. Insurance, believe it or not, is playing a huge part, because as we think through these processes and we say, okay, we're going to be a carbon negative, that's really predicated on we're doing carbon capture and sequestration, which is a huge anomaly for the insurance industry. They're not going to insure 100 years. They're going to do at most 5 years, and they're probably going to have government backing on those instruments. And, you know, you have an earthquake, what happens if you have that? There's just a lot of issues associated with it. So this is just my opinion. We're not going to go straight from where we're at to carbon neutral, carbon negative. It's, in my view, it's going to be a transitional, because there's just so many things from the chemistry side, from the insurance side, from the policy side, and from the finance side that have to come together. But I will say the pace is just happening so quickly. Tristan and Tim might have different views. I don't know.
Well, no, I actually completely agree with that, you know, with regard to that transition. And so I'll just give you an example that we're dealing with here in New York State. So we recognize, right, we're going to have to figure out how we get all of our heat from electricity. You know, we think about space heating. Jay and I were talking earlier about how cold it is out, right? You know, this is something where we're going to need heat. And I think the general expectation, and certainly here in New York, is that we're going to be using, you know, a combination of air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, but we're really going to be getting our heat from electricity. The problem is, even if you scale that up very, very rapidly, NYSERDA's estimate is that air source heat pumps at best are going to make up 50% of the New York State market a decade from now. So you're really talking, okay, you're not fully replacing our current sources of heat till 2040 or even later than that. And so this is where you need to start transitioning now, though, because if you wait till 2030 or 2040, well, that's additional greenhouse gas emissions, that's additional co-pollutant emissions that are going to have very negative effects. And so the reason I bring up, you know, this is an example in New York State. New York State has one of the country's rare bioheat mandates, right? New York still uses a lot of heating oil. You know, I think it's about 1/3 of the overall heat comes from heating oil. And so the state's recognizing, okay, we can't wait 20 years for air source heat pumps to take over all the natural gas heaters and, you know, standard heating oil heaters that we have. So we need to start reducing those greenhouse gas emission and co-pollutant emissions now using these transitional technologies that, you know, ideally they'll be obsolete in 20 years. But we can't wait 20 years to reduce those emissions. And, you know, it's also a bit of an insurance plan, right? You know, ultimately, if the technologies that we expect to arrive don't arrive, at least we're still reducing emissions more than we would if we relied on fossil fuels that entire time. So, you know, we think about the technologies we need to get to net zero, and we do not have those technologies today. There's going to have to be a tremendous amount of technological development. There's going to then have to be a tremendous and very rapid amount of commercialization. And we need to make sure that, that's the transition rather than we just wait 30 years and then hope we hit net zero 30 years from now.
Thank you.
As could I follow up to that as well? Is that okay?
Please.
Thank you. One of the things I became aware of recently was that New York State, in their carbon trading schemes, don't allow trading outside of current zones. For example, New York State or New York City, Zone 9, I think it is, can't buy carbon credits that are generated outside of Zone 9. How do we rectify that, or is it in process and being rectified, or what? How do we rectify that such that the New York economy is looked at as one economy, not 9 or 10 or 12 zones or whatever the number is?
Well, and I think at issue here is, right, there's language in the CLCPA, it's actually language that restricts how you can use any carbon offsets. And so I'm guessing this is what you're referring to, but what the language says, and this is, they put this in there for environmental and climate justice concerns, but ultimately they're worried that you're going to have, carbon offset projects that are going to be in, say minority communities, and then they're going to be, allowing emissions elsewhere, industrial emissions, things like that. And so there's language in the CLCPA that says that, any carbon offsets have to be located, I think it's within 30 miles of where they're ultimately going to be used, right? Or within 30 miles of the emissions that they're offsetting. So I think that's ultimately, and, I understand the logic behind that, but at the same time, that does restrict your ability, especially if you start thinking about sequestering CO2, that does restrict your ability to, get market value for that and, ultimately achieve that. And so I think that's going to be the main issue, is trying to find, how do you make sure that you get the benefits where you need them, but at the same time, you're not restricting a market that we're going to need to grow very rapidly in the coming 20 years.
Yeah, it just seems at odds, because the big pool of users are the 4 major urban areas and the island, right? So those 5 major areas, and there is very little, not very little. There's not enough within 30 miles of those areas to be able to even make a dent in the carbon offset market. You really need the impact of the rural areas to balance a lot of that out. Do you know of any moves to clarify that or change it in any way?
Well, I suspect there's going to be legal challenges, and not just in the sense, right, anyone can file a lawsuit, but California's experiences, 10 years ago went through this, it went through the federal courts, and so it's all been thoroughly litigated. New York State's approach, at least if you watch the Climate Action Council meetings, for example, is that, in addition to what I was talking about earlier, the state wants to make sure that, any emissions that they are controlling are being controlled within the state of New York, right? So for example, when you talk about whether it's carbon offsets or even you talk about decarbonization, they want to ensure that that occurs within New York State's borders, because that's what they can control. The problem is, we don't live just in New York State, right? We live in a federal entity, federal government, and we are governed by the US Constitution, which includes the Interstate Commerce Clause that says states cannot discriminate against commercial activity with other states. California went through this. The courts ultimately said, yeah, there's a very narrow exclusion to that. And so that governs California's low carbon fuel standard. But New York State, the conclusion though is New York State cannot say, okay, just New York State can participate, or these emissions can only occur in New York State. And so I think there's going to have to be a reckoning at some point. Now, within the 30-mile distance that we're talking about, I'm not entirely clear just yet how that's going to fit in, but New York State is starting to figure out, okay, maybe some of the ways that the laws have been written are not going to survive, a constitutional challenge. And so I think there will be some changes based on that type of thing moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions?
So I have a question. So Jay, I'm curious, you've been tracking biopreferred for years now. Is there data on the shift in the poll, right? So I'm assuming a lot of it started because of these federal mandates and some state mandates to buy biopreferred. And has that shifted? Is the proportion now, less government driven and more general consumers, or is there information on how that shift is occurring?
There isn't really that information on that shift. A couple reasons why. One, I and others have banged our head against the wall for the last few years. Our economy, all the sectors of the economy are done under what's called NAICS codes, North American Industry Classification System. And believe it or not, there are no NAICS codes for the bioeconomy that are granular. And that is overseen, and so it's not just myself and interested parties like that. It's also DOE and the labs that needed life cycle assessment modelers, et cetera. There's been resistance by Census, which oversees NAICS codes and development every 5 years, because they don't see it yet as a big enough industry. And so they asked for public, and they're mandated by Congress, and they did not listen and abide by that mandate. So they asked for some public comments. My public comment to them was, well, if you go back, you're acting like if you go back 100 years or so, that we're not going to start tracking the automobile because horse and buggies is the major industry and we don't see a future. It's asinine. But to answer your question, we need that really so that we can then track it within the industrial sectors and see where everything is going as the pull. I think we'll get there eventually, but intuitively, I think it's more industry based on their net zero and their sustainability imperatives, especially the larger institutional buyers, the retailers and brands that are actually pulling it. But you do see consumer demand. And that's the most important thing. So for a Target or a Nike or someone to say, we're going to require it or incentivize it, they need to see that consumers are willing to pay for it and they're asking for it. And that NYU Stern was a good indicator of that's happening, and there are other studies going on in the same lens.
Great, thanks.
So can we circle back a little bit to this question about distance from emitting source and the drive for New York to generate a fully functioning bioeconomy? Just for example, let's use New York City and all the emissions from buildings to heat and cool those buildings. It seems to me that it would make sense to offset them with, for example, materials that are grown upstate and harvested to then generate biochemicals and biofuels and other materials from that. But how do we do that given the fact that it's going to be farther than 30 miles?
So I think an important part of this is when you read the CLCPA, the first thing that jumps out is this is not a scientific document, right? It's a policy document, but doesn't necessarily have the best understanding of the scientific specifics and the technical specifics. And I think that, that the restriction we're talking about is certainly an example of that, because it seems to assume that you're necessarily talking about, say your standard oil or gas carbon capture and sequestration technology, right? And so that's ultimately the problem, is that, it's not really recognizing, okay, there's a whole lot more than that we're ultimately going to be deploying in New York State under the draft scoping plan. And so I think, there's going to be a lot of education that's going to have to occur. There will most likely need to be some changes. And, I'm not saying that just, in my own subjective opinion, but this is something, a week after the CLCPA was actually passed, right? This is what, the governor's office was coming out and saying, and we've got a new governor now, but you get the idea, right? There's been a general recognition that there's going to need to be some tweaks. And so I think, Jay, what you're talking about, that's a perfect example of where there is going to be need to be some education just to show, okay, here's the types of technologies we're actually looking at here in New York State. And maybe in some cases that 30-mile restriction is going to be, very difficult, or it's going to make it very difficult for these to scale up. And maybe it's not even something that's going to be necessary, right? You don't have the unintended consequences that provision is trying to exclude. So I think education ultimately is going to be a very critical aspect of this as we move forward with the CLCPA.
And Jay, I would add to it, I think economic development has to play a role in this, right? And so when you look at VC money investment, a lot of it from New York stays in the city.
Mhm.
And the opportunities for green jobs, green technology jobs, let's just put in jobs, in economically depressed or rural areas, et cetera, where that venture capital and those investments need to be made. I think that too has got to be a compelling discussion with those who are writing the legislation, understanding we have to balance it, right? I totally get the environmental justice lens, absolutely. But I think we also have to balance it with the opportunities to create tax base, economic growth, opportunities for people in the broader state of New York.
Mhm.
At least that would be
Yeah,
my
maybe it's interesting. I don't see like a solution where step one is 30 miles, step two is elsewhere within New York State or something similar, and step three is adjoining states that are in a certain radius, but something that kind of makes good economic sense, makes good sense from a justice perspective, and makes good sense from a balance perspective. It just seems to me that with the ESG focus, even from a VC and an investor community standpoint, I think you had a graph up there that showed some of the investments, but another way to look at it is if you look at the returns that those companies that have an ESG centric philosophy, operating philosophy, their returns are double-digit percentages higher, 10 and 15% higher than peers in their group that are not ESG centric. So that the money, the investment community at large sees this. It just seems to me that there's a disconnect in that policy that needs to be rectified before we can really fully realize the benefits from a bio-based economy.
Yeah, and these jobs are going to be created. The question is the state of New York going to make the investments and have the policies that are incentivizing people to do this in central New York, western New York, et cetera? Or are they going to go to North Carolina, Georgia, California, et cetera? Because the demand's not just domestic, it's international. So how do
Exactly.
So
we have time for one more question.
I apologize to everybody else. I didn't mean to monopolize the questions.
they were good questions.
I always seem to have lots. Still have lots more, so we can take them offline.
Only 1 minute left, so we will take, I guess, one more question and then wrap it up.
Well, I appreciate you guys putting this seminar on today. It's been great to participate, and I really appreciate the questions and interacting with everybody.
Likewise.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for agreeing to be on this panel.